Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 22nd of March 2021. We're here today to look at the future of the BBC. And as the way that we consume our media continues to evolve, the BBC faces particular challenges as it straddles its important public sector broadcasting obligation and has to raise enough money to deliver this, with the licence fee income, which is its main source of income, shrinking as audience numbers shrink. It's in the middle, of course, of negotiations with the government about the future of how that licence fee funding will operate. So it's got a considerable challenge ahead, and we've had previous discussions with the previous Director General, but I'm delighted that we've got the new Director General, Tim Davie, as one of our witnesses today to talk through the strategy that the BBC unveiled last week and the National Audit Office's excellent report, which underlines the considerable financial challenge that the BBC faces. So as well as Mr Davie as Director General, we have Glyn Isherwood, the Interim Chief Operating Officer at the BBC, and Charlotte Moore, who's the Chief Content Officer at the BBC. So a warm welcome to our witnesses, and I'm going to ask Gareth Bacon MP to kick off. Over to you, Mr Bacon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Initial question to Mr Davie. How concerned are you about the declining audiences that pose, or what sort of threat they pose to the future of the BBC? And to what do you attribute the declining audiences?
Thank you, and thank you, Chair, for your opening remarks. I think I've been very clear that I think that the media industry is not free from these seismic changes that the internet brings in terms of distribution. If you talk to whether it be taxi businesses, food delivery, retail, there is not a sector where suddenly, if you've had control or limited means of distribution, in our world that means linear channels, FM, if that is opened up and you get, in effect, infinite distribution, there is no doubt that poses fundamental challenges to traditional broadcast operations and media companies across the globe. We will no doubt come to the commercial businesses of the BBC, but I spent much of my time in that market. With regard to the BBC itself, and I would say thank you to the NAO, if I may, for a very helpful report. I think that I've been very clear and I think very transparent that there is jeopardy if we all care and want to maintain universality in terms of the BBC and its provision. I happen to believe that is worth fighting for. I can give you the glass half full statistics, which are 90% of the people in this country are still coming to the BBC weekly. We have seen really strong performances in terms of reach, but there is no doubt we need to deliver the value for the licence fee on reduced time spent. That is inevitable. Having said that, I think the BBC has got a strong case going forward with audiences for the unique value it brings, but there is jeopardy, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in terms of young audiences and more competition. Final point from me I am pleased to say, I think that to some degree, some of the absolutely, it's a spot-on analysis from the NAO in terms of some of the uncertainties going into the report, and I read it again last night, with regard to COVID impacts, over 75s, and the commercial impacts of that. I think we do have a little more certainty at this point. Of course, the big uncertainty, but it is within parameters, is the licence fee settlement for 22-27. So I think that's the overview from me. Jeopardy there, but certainly not to a point where we can't see the strength of the BBC, and we're sitting on some good numbers, which I think actually gives us some hope that we have a strong position to go forward from.
Thank you. Mr Bacon.
Thank you very much, Mr Davie. How sustainable do you think your current business model is if you are unable to stop the pace of decline? Because it's been declining for a while now. So if you're unable to change it, how sustainable do you think you're going to be going forward?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, to mention is that we have a charter, which is an incredible privilege, through to 27, which gives us sustainability to 27 in terms of a licence fee. And I have to say, when I absolutely, in my job have good, healthy paranoia about the sustainability of our model. But versus some of my commercial colleagues, that sustainability is an incredible privilege and does provide us some certainty in terms of us being able to do the right thing and build for the long term. My personal view is we can fight and preserve universality, but we have to be incredibly well focused on where we differentiate ourselves versus the rest of the market. We've always sat alongside competition. I've been very clear, I think, saying our role here is not to beat Netflix. Just to be clear to the committee, we're not going to beat Netflix. We're not going to beat them. We need to do something radically different. We make thousands more hours of local. I mean, the US streamers make about 200 hours of UK-originated content. The public service broadcasters make 30,000 hours. We're differently shaped. We always have sat alongside competitors. The issue is the BBC needs to be highly distinctive, whether that be bite-sized educational provision, locally made drama. I remain optimistic that we can maintain reach and maintain our value. But I have been very clear with the BBC. I think there is jeopardy there, and we have no inalienable right to exist. There can't be room for complacency about that.
Okay.
But I don't subscribe, for what it's worth, to the view that universality is an impossible mission to deliver.
Okay.
I mean, you've touched on the fact that the licence fee does give you a very solid platform to build on that your competitors don't have, and that's perfectly true. It is, of course, a privilege to have the licence fee, and I think we'll probably get into some of the detail around that later on, and whether the BBC is continuing to earn the right to have the licence fee. But how do you see the future balance of the business changing from traditional broadcasting to online viewing? Because that's where your main threat is coming now, isn't it?
Of course. Well, threat or opportunity. Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the dramas not everything has to be a threat. I'll give the fact that 6 million students went to Bite Size largely through online. Actually, weirdly, on that one, I put it back on linear for those households who didn't have good broadband connections. But if you look at many genres now, dramas, other things, I mean, we did 9.6 million on Line of Duty, so I suspect that may not do quite as much on iPlayer. Even we can't deliver that. But if you look at some of the medium-sized dramas, they're doing as much volume on iPlayer. Charlotte can talk about this later. I'm sure we'll get into the content discussion. So there are real privileges around, or there are real opportunities around online. The issue is you have to be on your toes. I mean, thank goodness we've got iPlayer. Thank goodness we've got sounds. And, we can begin to reshape our delivery. One of the things I'd note, and it was one of the only numbers with the NAO we would kind of dance around a bit, was the numbers are often attributed to TV viewing, linear viewing, or TV channel viewing. We're no longer, and I've restructured the content division, we're no longer looking at our numbers in that way. We're looking at delivery in the round. And there are opportunities there. I don't subscribe to the inevitable decline here, because it's about content and the quality of the content.
Okay. I mean, I'll push you a little bit, because currently you've said that online does give you an opportunity as well as a challenge, but the online viewing doesn't yet make up for the loss of your linear viewers, does it?
Indeed.
So what's going to change?
Well, over time, you've just got to keep... I mean, I don't want to minimise the challenges, because we're not in a naive place here. My bar here is to maintain very high reach, and I suspect we'll have slightly less of people's time, but we'll have to make that count. I'm just being open about that, because I think now within that, we have to keep growing sounds, we have to keep growing iPlayer, and we are seeing rapid growth. We're actually winning share on iPlayer. Now, again, we'll see that migration over time. Reach to news at the moment is 86% of the adult population. Yeah, that's up 5 points versus a year ago. Now, except it has been a fairly tumultuous news year, but we've delivered a lot of that reach to online. I think over time, the primary reach is online. That's where we've got to go.
Okay. Mr. Bacon.
You touched on content a couple of times, so I'm going to switch now to Ms. Moore, because you are the senior person for content within the BBC. What assurance can you give us that any new plans you have for addressing the decline will succeed where previous attempts have not?
Well, I think where Tim said, we did come at this from a very good place. And again, I don't want to be complacent, but I think, despite this explosion in competition, which is both for content itself, which has caused huge inflation, there's a massive competition for that content, but also there's real competition for audiences. And as you said, Mr. Bacon, it's particularly younger audiences and it's underserved audiences. And we've done a lot to really try and identify and understand who are those audiences that, as I say, we are reaching. We reach 80% of 16 to 34-year-olds every week on the BBC, and we reach 93% every month. So they're coming to the BBC. But our job really and our priority, and Mr. Davie and the team that I work with, we've really set out a very focused plan to prioritise how we reach all audiences, because universality is what we're about, but to really try and understand where we're not reaching those audiences with as much content as we'd like for them to feel that they get enough value from the BBC. And we're really looking at where those audiences are and what content we should be making that would make them feel that there was value in the BBC and the licence fee that they're paying. That probably splits into four main things that we're doing. Partly we're looking at our content mix, and are we making the right content that reaches all audiences and that younger audiences and underserved audiences feel is relevant to them as well. And I would state shows like Line of Duty last night with enormous 16 to 34 figures really show that we can do that. Strictly this year, I mean, it was the largest Strictly we've had in 10 years for younger audiences. Top Gear, Sewing Bee, the shows that we've moved from BBC Two to BBC One to really maximise the value that audiences get from that content that we make, but to make sure it reaches a wider audience. So first of all, it's really focusing on our big brands and how can we make sure we keep those really healthy and relevant to younger audiences. The next thing, of course, is iPlayer and the work that we're doing to really bring more audiences to iPlayer. And actually, it has, the last couple of months, been a landmark moment for the BBC and for the growth of iPlayer. The growth of iPlayer amongst young adults more than offset the year-on-year decline in broadcast TV for the first time this January. And that's very exciting for us. We were growing total TV minutes month on month and year-on-year in the year 1920, but in January, for young audiences, we actually went above that and offset it. So, look, we've only had that critical 12-month window for our content that allows iPlayer to be a destination for young people in its own right, that allows us to have box sets, that allows us to reach young audiences who, of course, want whatever content they want, whenever they want it, at any time. So we've only just reached that critical moment, but it's very exciting to see that growth, because I think it shows if we've made that progress in the last year, we can make more. The next thing that we've done, and again, I can talk about this later in more detail, is BBC Three. And we've committed to make sure that younger audiences and underserved audiences, which I think includes many of our lower socioeconomic groups that we've identified, we really want to make sure that the success of BBC Three that we've had in the last 3 years, making extraordinary content like Normal People, This Country, we've had some fantastic shows, Young Offenders, In My Skin, we've had some great shows. We want to make sure that we can do more of that. So we've doubled our budget for that For Me content for the young 16 and now 13 to 34. In order to make sure, and we're very aware, and I think what Mr. Davie was talking about with lockdown learning and bite size, we've realised just what the digital divide means in the UK today. And we're very aware that not all of that audience that we're going after has access to multiple devices. Many of those homes will only have one television, and they may not have access either to fast broadband. And that's become really obvious to us when we did lockdown learning. We saw the numbers that we showed our content on BBC Two, the numbers of young people coming to that, number of parents and teachers and pupils using that content really showed us how effective it can be on linear. So we're going to bring, what we'd like to do is bring BBC Three back as a linear channel. This isn't going backwards in my mind, this is absolutely going forwards. It's looking at the maximum value we can give to audiences, particularly younger audiences, of that double the budget content that we're putting into BBC Three. So in fact, I asked Mr. Davie when we started, I said, you know what, why wouldn't we do it? The cost it takes to actually go onto the channel once you've made that content is minimal, really, and it really is about making sure that we can maximise the impact of that content.
Okay, thank you.
The final thing I'd say, just to add in the sort of plan that we have for growing young audiences, because obviously that BBC Three content, by being on a channel, will also activate iPlayer and be a trigger for iPlayer and allow audiences that perhaps don't realise quite what we have on offer, they'll actually come to the BBC and explore much, much more and the thousands of hours that we have available to them. But the other thing critically is we really recognise that some of the audience we're not reaching is also, or that we're not reaching enough or frequently enough, is in the north and in some of the nations, in Scotland and Northern Ireland. We know that we need to provide more content and allow them to understand there is more content. So the plans that we announced last week, which are to expand our footprint across the UK, to really double down on decision-making, authentic portrayal of communities all across the UK, is part of our BBC Three plan as well. And we really want to focus a lot of the content that we're budgeted to make now on BBC Three. Nearly 2/3 of it, or we aim to have 2/3 of it, will be spent across the UK, and we intend to expand both in radio, audio and in television iPlayer. Our money that will go into expanding content across the UK, I hope, will also help to get closer to those audiences and to serve those underserved audiences a lot better, and therefore bringing value. So it's a very clear plan set about on that high impact content that Mr. Davie set out with our priorities, but absolutely about extracting all the value we can from our services and our products, and particularly from online.
Mr. Bacon.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive answer, Ms. Moore. Much of what you said, you did talk about the regions towards the end of your answer, but most of it was about attracting younger viewers. Do you have any understanding or figures or analysis of how you are retaining pre-existing viewers and whether you are losing them? I'd be quite clear about what I'm asking here, because judging by my inbox, you are losing audience, and I'm wondering what you're doing to reverse that trend.
Well, I would just say as well that some of the figures in the report do refer to TV and not, as Mr. Davie said, including iPlayer as well. And so we really can see huge growth in iPlayer viewing from the 35 to 54-year-olds, and indeed from the 55 plus. Of course, we know young audiences perhaps were the people that first migrated to digital viewing, but absolutely this is now becoming more the norm. So again, I think it's very important to look at all these figures in the round across all of our services and products. But yes, do we understand audiences and who we're not reaching? And you're absolutely right. It isn't just about younger audiences, it's absolutely about reaching all audiences, and the plans that we set out last week about across the UK and expanding the impact that we have with audiences across the UK is absolutely about that. It's about trying to get closer to audiences and make sure that we can increase the consumption and impact of our output between those different audience groups across the UK. Now, we do look at those audiences and we compare the usage and we compare both the time spent and the reach, but we also look at whether audiences feel that our output is having effectiveness, and we give them effectiveness scores, whether people feel that the content is for them. And we have seen that some of the groups that we talked about, there is lower levels of usage of the BBC compared to the comparative groups. And again, when I said those statistics earlier, we know that we have it's 97% of adults come to us every month. But of course, we can see that differs from different parts of the country and different segmented audiences. So we have been looking at that and really trying to map our content to make sure what do we need to be making to reach those audiences across the UK that perhaps we haven't reached in as much quantity. So there's absolute relative appeal scores that we look at. And we can
so are you concerned that you're losing previous punters? So people.
Can I, Charlotte, if I may, respond? But overall, the data is pretty clear, which is overall reach, and I suspect your inbox has some of the same individuals I do, which bluntly, overall, reach is holding up. Mm-hmm. So even a lot of people who are dissatisfied or want the BBC to do more for them, or feel that we may have got the wrong view on something, largely the research is that they're still coming to the BBC. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to be blunt with the committee, the people I'm most worried about are those people who are not the BBC is not part of their repertoire, or younger people who haven't connected with the BBC. Now, when it comes to those more, there is nothing more important for an organisation like ourselves to make sure our core viewers and listeners are sticking with us. The data suggests overall they are, but the time spent is a bit under pressure for certain groups. So they may be going elsewhere and doing different things. That is something that we should be conscious of, and is why, we'll get to it in this discussion, I'm sure, but that is why we want to make sure representation across the country is there. We want to make sure we've got the right local provision. These things are critical in terms of holding up the support of the BBC.
Okay, so sorry, I have to cut across you. Not because just that the answers are quite long and lots of other members will need to get in. So you're generally content that your reach is holding up okay. You want to tweak it a little bit by bringing back BBC Three. It does beg the question of why BBC Three was dropped in the first place. Is that because the content was no good at that time and it's going to be refreshed this time, or are there other reasons?
Not at all. It was largely a very simple thing, which was there was an assumption about the migration path of digital, and we had to make choices around our budget. It's a strange one because I don't particularly like going back to the future, but the truth is the linear has proved to be very resilient is the right word, sorry, in terms of over the last few years. And it was a very straightforward decision, which if you actually look at the incremental cost of having a linear channel, and remember we've cut back CBBC a bit, so I'm using the same capacity, so I'm not having to buy more capacity. It makes absolute sense to deliver reach to more families with that, what is essentially a relatively small incremental amount of money. So no, it's never a question of the content.
Well, the reason it was dropped then was because nobody was watching it. So why would they watch it now?
Well, that's just simply not true. The reach. I mean,
so it was very popular and it was dropped anyway.
Yeah, because the BBC had to make choices around where it spent its money, distribution versus content. The BBC's had its budget cut 30% since 2010, so we're going to probably get into the efficiencies and all the things we've had to do. I think we felt optimistic about being able to deliver reach through digital. That migration has not happened as fast as it should do. But, I mean, have a look at, we can go back and submit the performance numbers for BBC Three were not bad at all.
Okay. So it's a popular channel and you dropped it because you wanted to do more online, more digital.
Correct.
Right. Okay, so why will that work now then when it didn't work then?
Well, what do you mean when it works now? We're going back to what was working.
So it was working. Right, okay, fine. So does that mean you're abandoning the digital side, or you're waiting for it to power up?
No, of course not. I mean,
forgive me, I don't mean to be cynical. I'm just wondering why, if it didn't work before, it's going to work now. Well, why this is the answer to your falling audience share. I haven't really heard it.
It's not the only answer. It is one component part, and it's a highly statistical piece of analysis that says if you are trying to just deliver reach cost effectively to that audience, what is the best way of doing it? The primary goal is to have give Charlotte a good commissioning budget of over 70 million, which we've invested more heavily in to say, okay, we want the content. Once you have the content, I'm somewhat agnostic about the distribution. In other words, it doesn't matter whether it's on iPlayer. I just want people to connect with those shows and the brand. Yeah.
Right. So it does come back to the original question.
All I'm doing is looking at the most cost-effective distribution. Yeah. I'm less worried about whether it's future, past. I just want to do that.
Mr. Bacon.
It comes back to the original question that I asked them was the content is going to be different on BBC Three this time as to last time. Is that fair?
Well, we're investing more in content, and of course we learn. I mean, Charlotte might want to answer, but we learn as we go. But no, of course, I think we absolutely see distinctive youth content, particularly with the other thing that BBC Three does well is a bit more social purpose than others. So we're not just about hunting for audience; we're also doing about the right things on the BBC purposes. I think we're getting better at that. I think there's some fantastic shows on BBC Three.
Okay, going to move on a wee bit. One of the things that platforms like Netflix have is that they can personalise their content. So based on your previous viewing habits, they can make recommendations for things to use for you to log in and see in the future. How is the BBC making use of new technology to personalise the content that you're going to be putting out going forward?
We're doing a lot of that within our online products, and one of the 4 priorities I talked about my strategy is very, very simple, which is how do you, as a household, get more value for £157.50? It's as simple as that. And it's about trusted news, high impact content. So when you're looking at that infinite choice of an evening, we make the cut. The next one was about those online products. And of course, we need a degree of personalisation there. We need algorithmic technology. We need all the things. And we've got good teams. We have a very capable design engineering team working on products like iPlayer. Yep. The one thing I would say is we don't want to, in my view, editorially, and this is where I don't think we're just simply copying the US streamers. I mean, I don't know how you find, but I find some of that personalisation too much. It pigeonholes me. If I buy something, it may keep recommending when I think as the BBC, we also have a curatorial role where we, as the newsroom and as the iPlayer, can choose things that we think are important. It's not just driven wholly algorithmically, but we have sophisticated algorithmic technology and building our capability in that area. We also have millions of people now signed in. We need to do more.
Okay. So what is the BBC's USP, unique selling point, going to be in what is now a very crowded digital environment?
High quality British content that you can trust. I mean, we are absolutely coming from a different point of view. We're not trying to make
that's very clear, I think.
Yeah, we're not trying to make a paid subscription business work. I'm there for everyone, and I want to have highly differentiated UK IP. And one of the things we've got to do together is decide for the UK how much IP do we want to own locally, regionally. I'm talking news IP, and I'm talking TV and radio. And if we care about the creative industries, which is an incredible success story, our role is to deliver that IP and also act as a catalyst for the wider creative industries. There's no model of success for the BBC, by the way, that isn't driving the wider creative industries. We're incredibly porous in terms of the amount of money we flow throughout to 14,000 small companies, 50,000 people that are working on BBC projects. That is what we're here for. We have a different purpose. I'm not running a business for profit. I'm running a business for purpose. Or an organisation for purpose. I'm not running a business.
Mr. Bacon.
No, the media market's changed rapidly, exponentially over the last 15 to 20 years. And you have previously said that the BBC has been quite sluggish and quite unresponsive to change, or slow to change, not unresponsive, slow. What do you think the impact of being slow to change has been? And do you think the BBC is still slow to respond?
It's funny, I think we've been patchy. We're still kicking at 99 years old. We're still delivering 90% reach. And if you went into the newsroom at 5 to 10 with a story breaking, you wouldn't say the BBC slow to change. I also think the way we've gone into online and the iPlayer, I've got a queue to my door of people from around the world in public service broadcasting say, how on earth did we move so fast and respond in the way we've done? So if I'm allowed a smidgen of pride around the BBC in that regard, what I do think is all organisations that are entrenched, we've got fixed revenue, can be slightly slow to respond to consumer changes. And, if you look at something like the audio market, no one loves linear radio like I do. I care about it passionately. But the truth is, we have to move into sounds, we have to go into other areas. And I almost say it with slightly heavy heart, sounding like the old stick in the mud here, but you've got to move faster. I just think we can move with more speed into some of those areas. It's not rocket science, this, and that's what we've got to do.
Thank you.
How do you plan to make that happen?
Well, as editor-in-chief, I've been very clear about establishing jeopardy and a burning platform for the BBC, and very clearly, the biggest lever I've got, honestly, is to give leaders full accountability for audience metrics and very clear delivery targets and get on with it. It's simply about leading the organisation and making the case about external change rather than assuming that we can just continue as we are. And that is hard. It's hard in terms of cultural change. That's the heart of what we've got to do.
Okay. Now, I'm going to finish off my section by talking about COVID, because, of course, we can't talk about anything these days without touching on COVID.
Yeah.
What impact do you think COVID has had on BBC audiences?
Well, there's the audience question, the financial audiences. We've seen very good audiences too. I was crediting the news team of course, when we're in a pandemic like this, people come to trusted sources, so it will not surprise you that reach, I mentioned earlier, reach to our news services has gone up 5%. Total population, 86% was the last number I saw. Overall reach of 90%. And you see those services, again, I mentioned it, bite-sized, 6 million. So overall, we're broadly up. Viewing up 8% of BBC television. So, look, we're seeing good numbers. That's not surprising when you lock people in their households and you're running a media business.
Okay,
but
yeah.
I think there is something deeper going on, which is people are coming in a world of, it's a broader topic. I was on something this morning talking about it to journalists around the world. In a world of misinformation, you'll all have your views on how well we're doing, but, an organisation that is at its heart trying to get fair, impartial coverage and proper public information out has been a place where people have come to. Sorry if I may make one other quick point, which is the biggest show over the period in UK television has been the 6:30 regional news. And the other thing, that's bigger than anything, by the way, anything. And the thing that the pandemic has also taught us is the validity of local, regional, national storytelling. So what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Wales, Northern Ireland, all these things have proved themselves extremely important to people.
Sure. I think one of my colleagues is going to come in on that a bit later on, but it occurs to me that one of the things, or several of the things that you lost out on, everyone lost out on collectively last summer, would be things like Wimbledon, the Olympics, Euro 2020. Do you think that these things have had an impact on viewing figures, or do you think you've...
Of course, it's mechanical. That you lose the reach from the sports events. I have to say, though, things like the FA Cup and the Six Nations, we had 64% of the Welsh population watching England beat Wales.
I think you'll probably find that Wales beat England, sadly. But...
sorry, that was a bit... that was wishful thinking in my mind. Sorry, Wales beat... I've got the horrors of the French match in my mind. But yes, when Wales beat England, apologies to everyone for that. But that was 64% of the population. So we've still been able to deliver big numbers through sport, but there's no doubt some of those events that move, like Wimbledon, you lose out. But we've more than made up for that through the other things I've just talked about.
Okay. Now, what about people's viewing habits over lockdown? Obviously, I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of your dramas, for example, certainly initially in the lockdown, you weren't able to make, so your production schedule sort of slipped a wee bit. Have you been able to make those up? I mean, I know that you plugged a lot of the gap with pre-recorded stuff or repeats or whatever. So do you think that people's viewing habits have been permanently changed by this?
It's not been easy. Charlotte, do you want to answer that?
I think we've seen real impact for the very fact, as you say, that we didn't have as much sport, and those big sporting events are often real activators for people coming to the BBC and coming to iPlayer. We saw huge success with shows like Salisbury Poisonings, Normal People, I May Destroy You. We had some content, and some drama particularly, that was nearly finished, and we were able to get it through and spread that throughout the summer. And as you say, we brought in acquisitions, and we did lots of repeats, and we reversioned content. So we made the best of what we could with a much smaller budget. And for several months, we weren't able to make drama or comedy. We made entertainment programmes like The Big Night In. We managed to get Spring Watch on air. We moved The Repair Shop and got huge numbers. I mean, in many ways, some of the hits of COVID for us were shows like The Repair Shop, really sort of fantastic, bring the family together, heartwarming shows, and we managed to entertain as well. But we were operating with smaller budgets during that period because of having to delay sports and having to be really agile with our schedules. And of course, some of that we're only managing to get up into production on some of the projects, so things have been delayed. So it was a constant juggle of the schedules, and it continues to be so, to be honest. And we've managed to, make sure that shows like Line of Duty, which have taken a lot longer in the edit and a lot longer to finish because they have to stop midway through production. But thankfully, everyone rose to the challenge. We've managed to get huge numbers for shows like that. And Strictly, we didn't have as many episodes of Strictly, for instance, but we managed to have one of the best Strictlys we've ever had, with the largest young figures. So, look, it's been extremely challenging. And I think viewing behaviours have changed. I think it's given more ability for people to discover choice elsewhere, and not everybody's had the same pressures that we've had. Some of these streamers globally have been able to make dramas all over the world, wherever it's been COVID safe. And we've obviously been operating under restrictions in the UK and unable to travel. So it's absolutely impacted our schedules. And you'll have noticed that shows like Call the Midwife, which thankfully is coming to our screens again soon, usually would pay out in January, as would Silent Witness. We'd have had many more dramas, many more comedies than we were able to have. And again, we made the most of it at Christmas and had some of our highest viewing ever. And I think a lot of that was also because of the box set offer that we managed to have on iPlayer because of the change in our windowing and our rights for box sets. So, look, we've got through it, but it will take us some time for all that drama to come through. And I think the next year will be incredibly important to us. And those big sporting events coming up will be the way that we bring viewers in who may have become slightly less frequent viewers. With EastEnders back on air, again, that's really able to bring in those frequent viewers to then allow people to see the amazing choice that we have on iPlayer.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon.
My final question to you is, you mentioned earlier on, Ms. Moore, in your final answer that the pandemic has given people the opportunity to go elsewhere. Are you confident that they will return?
Yeah, I mean, when I say they've had lots of choice, I would also say it's given them the opportunity to explore iPlayer, and we've had the largest ever figures, and we've broken all records for the extraordinary number of hours that we've had on iPlayer. Billions of requests, in a way that I think it has benefited us. And as Mr. Davie said, we are growing our market share as well of iPlayer in an extremely competitive marketplace. So again, I think we're doing very well, all things considered. And actually, our share during the pandemic has actually, been driven, obviously, as Mr. Davie said, the 6:30 news has brought huge numbers, and we've done such a great job of informing, educating, as well as entertaining, that we actually have managed to stem the tide of decline on linear. And actually, in the year during the pandemic, we've done very well from it. But we're not complacent, and that's why our very clear plan and priority to really focus on audiences that we're not reaching frequently enough. They come to us, 95% of young come to us, but we've really got to make sure there's more on offer and that they come to kind of explore the range. So I don't think we're at all complacent. And earlier I think you said we're content. I don't think we're content. I think everybody realises in the media landscape at the moment, the competition is huge. And I think if I was a streamer, I would be saying exactly the same. There is huge competition. Do I think that we fulfil a very distinctive place in that marketplace, which perhaps is becoming more and more defined because of the wealth of competition? We are absolutely sure what we're here to do. And that is in the breadth and range of the content we make. It's the breadth and range of our drama, our comedy, our factual, our entertainment, and the sports that we're able to offer to a universal audience. So, I'm not complacent or content. I think we really have to carve out that space, and making use of the fact that we are both locally and across the nations and regions, across the whole of the UK, we are able to tell those stories and find talent from across the UK, I think will make us stand out in this very competitive marketplace.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'm done with my section now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacon. We may come back to you a little later. I'm now going to ask Peter Grant MP to come in and talk a bit about the nations, among other things. Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Before I do that, can I come back to the Director General, please, to follow up a couple of his comments earlier on? I'm looking particularly at licence-paying numbers as opposed to the reach as measured by other methods. If we're able to take out the impact of changes to the arrangements for providing licences for the over 75s, which has caused a bit of turbulence for the BBC, what's your assessment of the number of people, say, within the last 5 years who have just stopped paying the licence because they don't want to have a licence anymore? And what information do you have as to the reasons behind those decisions?
I mean, I can turn to Glyn in a second. We can see, the number of evasion is broadly in line, marginally up, but the number
to be clear, Mr. Davie, I'm not talking about people who dodge the licence. I'm talking about people who make a conscious decision to stop accessing
Oh, I'm sorry.
activities.
Households who claim they don't need a licence.
No. I want to be perfectly clear. In fact, you've reminded me of an issue that I do have, that my constituents who have decided not to do anything that requires a licence are being hounded on behalf of the BBC, accused of fraud for not paying the licence. So it's something that I want to be absolutely clear about. I'm not talking about people who are doing anything vaguely disreputable. I'm talking people who have taken a rational decision not to do anything that requires a licence, who therefore decide not to acquire a licence anymore. What information do you have over, say, the last 5 years as to how many people have taken that legitimate lawful decision and what the reasons behind it might be?
Glyn, do you want to just give the numbers and I can give an observation then?
Yeah, while we don't have with us the last 5 years numbers, we do know that last year there was a small increase, and the current figures are at 1.7 million people who've taken that option, and that grew from the previous year from about 1.5. So it's still relatively small. I mean, that's in the context of we have annual licences between 25 and 26 million each year. So it's quite solid in terms of level of support for licence fee, but there is a number of people who take that option.
Can I get some clarification? I think numbers you quoted were 1.7 million compared to 1.5 million.
Yes,
correct. Is that 1.7 million additional people who haven't renewed a licence? Is it 1.7 million people who don't have a licence?
No.
And if so, how do you measure that? Because there's not 54 million licences in the UK. There's tens of millions of people who don't have a licence. How do you measure that 1.5 or 1.7 million?
No, so licence is collected on the basis of number of households in the UK. There are more than 27 million households in the UK. At the moment, 1.7 million of those take the option that you stated and don't elect to have one and do not enjoy the BBC services. And then the rest of them, more than 25 million at the moment, do have that option and pay for the licence. And that includes people over the age of 75, some of who get a free licence if they're in receipt of pension credit. So it's only been a small increase from 1.5 million the previous year to 1.7, so that's a 200,000 increase. So I don't think it's true to say it's substantially growing, but we could get you the figures that look back over the last 5 years.
But if you look at the impact it has on the BBC's finances, you're talking about either side of 1% of your licence fee income disappearing in a single year. And although 1% of your main source of income may not seem an awful lot, 1% of your operating surplus or potential operating deficit year on year can become quite significant. Do you have any concerns that if that 200,000 pure licences a year becomes a regular trend, at what point does it start to undermine the financial sustainability of the whole operation?
So we are very fortunate to have a secure form of funding through licence fee, guaranteed right out to the end of the charter. As I said, licence fee can go up and down, number of licences go up and down, but it's moved between 25 and 26 million over the last 5 years. You're right, over the last kind of couple of years, we have seen a little bit of decline, but there's still strong support around licence fee. The types of decline we're talking around are in the region of 1%. And actually what we've seen through this year, despite the operational challenges of collecting during a global pandemic and all the issues that's given people in getting out and about to pay the licence fee, or indeed us running our call centre, we did see decline in the first quarter, but actually in quarters 3 and 4 we saw it come back really strongly as people sought to find a way to pay the licence this year. So I think we remain cautiously optimistic that there's still strong support, and we can't do anything to reverse the change in media consumption habits, and some people are finding viewing in other places and changing habits, and for some people they can take option not to have the BBC licence.
Glyn, just to be clear, there's two levers to the number we're talking about in terms of our income risks. One is the level of households, obviously, and the other is this number of 1.7 million that say that are no longer needing, or say that they don't technically qualify for the licence. It's worth saying we are watching that number like hawks. I mean, this is our revenue and the majority of our revenue, so it's utterly critical to us. if we look in the longer term, we don't see that. We see, obviously we are healthily concerned about that, but the balance is we're also seeing forecasts of household growth as well. So you've got pretty much a scenario in which you can see 25 million through this period, and we can talk beyond 27. But for the next 5 years, you can see a number, 25 million odd households. And that is supported again by the earlier discussion on the facts around usage of the BBC services, which is holding up pretty well, despite all the debate around it. So, but your question is spot on in terms of it is a number that we must watch and is clearly critical to us in terms of maintaining our broad income within the licence.
So if you're watching that 200,000 lost licence payers in a year, can you tell me what information do you have about the reasons why those 200,000 customers walked away? Do you have factual information on it, or is it just estimates and assumptions?
It's not estimates, it's factual. In terms of individual motivations, Glyn, I don't know whether we've got anything that would bring a bit of colour and texture to that.
I don't think we're not able to collect information around why people leave, but we do have a natural sort of turnover of households. We do occasionally do studies around people's propensity to pay and their desire to pay, but we'd have to come back with you with that information. I don't have that today.
If you don't know why they're choosing not to, how is it possible for you to take steps to persuade the next 200,000 people to carry on paying? If you don't know
it's a question of how granularly you make the analysis. I mean, the reason why they're not is they're claiming, they're saying, understandably, that in a world of, it's exactly the conversation we've been in, which is in a land of a lot of competition. Are they watching a live television stream? So it's not surprising that when on-demand is burgeoning the way it is and other services are there, you're going to get some marginal erosion of people who are not watching a live stream on television. Now, our role is simply to make very relevant content, build the role of live, and do all the things we've talked about. I won't go through that. We could take too much of the committee's time. But I think we understand in some detail, and we're speaking to audiences all the time about the overall specifics of the market change, and it's without doubt. I mean, I think you can look at this number two ways. I mean, I think the number is overall for the BBC is proving itself to be resilient versus other sectors and the level of change we're getting. But as I say, we need to be conscious of it and doing our work as we've talked earlier in the session.
Thank you. I know that we're going to be a bit short of time later, so I'll leave that question for just now. I want to come back to you, Mr. Davie, about the announcement you made last week, in which, among other things, you announced an additional £700 million, I think it was, to be spent outside of London. How does that tie in with the BBC's ongoing need to make significant financial savings on what you term the nations and regions spend?
Making savings everywhere in terms of getting more efficient. What this is looking at is, I mean, currently we spend, in terms of video content, about 1.4 billion. So over time, if you multiply that over the years, it's a huge sum of money. And what we've said is 10% of that, very specifically. And this isn't about increasing our budgets. This is simply what we should be doing with our budgets to extract more value. So it's not about incremental spend at this point. By the way, the good news is it is incremental spend if you're outside the M25 and you're a producer or a maker of programs, because it means money's coming your way. But it's not incremental spend. It's 60% of Charlotte's television budget and 50% of the radio budget versus previous 50%, nearly 40%, coming outside the M25. And what that allows us to do is for producers in Scotland, producers in the nations and regions, to have, frankly, a bigger slice of money to make critically network production in areas beyond London. And that's what we want to do. And it's really important. This is also about portrayal and representation as well. So we want those dramas based in, Scotland and other places. I mean, I have to say, we've been talking to Creative Scotland, all the Northern Ireland Screen, all the various bodies. I think this is really good news for them in terms of getting more money.
Mr. Grant.
Thank you. But coming back to my initial question, and incidentally, I think you described some of the previous cuts as efficiency savings. Certainly some of the cuts that have been made in the Nations and Regions news teams over the last few years have not been about efficiency. They've had a significant impact on either the amount or the quality of the output. But the question was, is this new money after you've netted off the impact of the savings that you said you still have to make in Nations and Regions, or do we have to take the value of those savings off the £700 million that you announced last week?
No, these, very specifically, these are separate too. So yes, we will be delivering through the savings plans, which we're largely through, by the way, in terms of, I mean, you've seen, hopefully in the NAO's report, I think we should be proud. It's been very tough work, but we have delivered 950 million plus of savings. And no, those plans are largely done, by the way, and we're largely through them. We've got one announcement last week with regard to network news, but we're largely through that phase of plans. That we now come into, obviously, the 22-27 window and see what we need to do there. But you're right, by the way, to pick me up, because the vast majority was efficiency, but you can't avoid scope in certain places.
Thank you. And obviously, anybody who represents a constituency outside of London is going to welcome the possibility of any kind of BBC work being carried on in other parts of the United Kingdom because of the potential for job creation and so on. But are you able to give more details just now as to what difference that is going to make to what's actually being produced? For example, I know that your technology team are mainly moving to Salford, and there will be smaller numbers posted in a number of your other studios. Will the viewing public notice any difference in the technology stories that you carry with the technology programmes? Are you simply moving the production somewhere else with the intention of producing pretty much the same kind of programmes you did before?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because I think that there's two parts to it. One more direct is a direct yes without question. The other is, I think, takes a bit more time. Let me explain what I mean by that. The money going across for scripted productions that Charlotte's teams will push across the UK are absolutely about representation and portrayal in those regions. So one of the announcements was we're going to look to rearrange our continuing drama offer to make sure one is set in a nation network and one is set in the north of England. There is no doubt that will have a direct impact on audiences' appreciation scores and how close they feel to the BBC. So in scripted, I think it's very proven. When it comes to news output, story teams, technology, and presenting programmes like Newsnight from Glasgow and other things, I personally am a believer that does change the very nature of the editorial. I think Five Lives feels different because it's in Salford, not in London. I think Six Music feels different when a lot of it comes from Salford. I think you begin to change the shape of editorial. I think you begin to change the way people refer to stories, the way they think about the UK. I think that can only be helpful, and over time it counts. It counts, I think.
Okay, Mr. Grant.
Thank you. I'll maybe try and come in later on, Chair. I've got some other questions I want to ask, but I know there's several other members I keen to mention now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. And I think we are interested to hear as we go forward about how much the savings you're making will materialise into investment outside London. So we'll come back to that a little later. And I must apologise to Mr. Isherwood. Mr. Isherwood, I misintroduced you. You are, of course, the Chief Financial Officer at the BBC. So my sincere apologies. For, I'm not sure which was whether I was downgrading you or upgrading you, but you're not acting anything. You are the Chief Financial Officer. So apologies for that. I now want to turn to James Wilde, MP. Over to you, Mr. Wilde.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Davie, you talked earlier in your opening remarks about jeopardy in the licence fee. Yet the report says that the BBC hadn't modelled the impacts of a fundamental change to the licence fee from next April. Why weren't you better prepared for these negotiations?
We've only just begun our negotiations and responded to DCMS as part of the process. Within that, clearly, we've got controllable elements and we've got elements we can't control. The controllable elements of our commercial return, our cost base, I think we're fully across. When it comes to the income, that process now begins with DCMS And I think we're well prepared and laying out a clear plan. Remember, we've also got some runway on this one from a business planning point of view. So we have a fully agreed, budget with the BBC board for 21-22 in some detail. So we're not staring at, something that is going to change in the next 2 months. So clearly there's levels of jeopardy, significant jeopardy around the licence fee, but I think we're in a reasonable position versus most of our peers and how you would see an organisation of our size.
Yeah, it's just odd you hadn't done any of that modelling until the process has sort of kicked off, as it were. I mean, this is going to set the licence fee through to 2027, and you've been asked to assume flat cash as the baseline for your submission. Obviously, a number of my constituents, Mr. Moyes, one of them, who's written to the committee, would like to see licence fee abolished, if not cut. How likely do you think it is that there's going to be a freeze in the licence fee for that whole period?
Well, I think that really is it. I mean, I as you can tell, I will answer any question, but I think that has to, likelihood of a freeze is absolutely something that is not a question for me, and it's a question for DCMS. I think that, I think we've got a good, robust process working and with DCMS exchanging information. I think there's a clear case for sustainable investment in the BBC, but that's something we need to work with DCMS. Now, clearly, we're doing our, we do our planning. I think it's appropriate. We have a process with DCMS where we're responding to their requests as you've outlined them, and we go from there.
You said it's a realistic possibility, particularly given the wider climate we're in at the moment, a freeze is on the cards.
I'm not speculating on anything. I don't think it's my job to do it. I think I've made the case, I think, there for sustainable investment in the BBC, and that's where I am.
Okay, and one of the things your announcement referred to last week was the added value, this KPMG report that you produced. Why did you wait 10 years to sort of update the last economic impact of the BBC?
I'm not sure about the pause, to be totally honest with you. I think it was due. I take the NAO's point that it's useful to have that economic impact report, and I'm glad we've done it. So I think clearly it's the right time to do it as we go into this work.
Is that something you're going to commit to do more regularly on a 3-5 year basis, rather than sort of leaving it?
I'll certainly consider that. I haven't got in my head what the exact time frame is. All I say, it's very useful for me. I mean, quite frankly, it's a very useful report to show the multiplier effect of the BBC, investing in the BBC, and what it brings. So there's without being kind of funny about it, there's no downside for me to have that report. I think we've got a very strong case actually in terms of the BBC's, as I say, multiplier effect. And that works on a number of ways. It's not just the money we're putting into the licence fee, but if you look at the jobs created in Salford in the creative industries since we went up there, I mean, the creative industries are dependent on creating world-class hubs. There's absolutely no doubt. I mean, I speak as chair of the Creative Industries Council, and I think that we have a very compelling case in terms of how this anchor investment, if you talk to small independent companies, whether that be in Northern Ireland working on BBC Three projects, BBC Scotland, Scottish Channel, BBC Scotland working on projects there, there's absolutely no doubt about it that I think we've got a strong case in terms of the economic impacts of the BBC. I think it's curiously efficient use of spending in this way, because it's also very accountable, because you can look at us and say, are we delivering for £157.50? I am a passionate believer of the public and private ecosystem that works on the creative industries. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have a world-class creative industries. I think it is due to the interventions of whether it be free museums or the BBC. And I think we should fight to protect that. It's worth investing in. We'll clearly be making the case that, we need investment to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously four things that will need investment are your four priorities that you set out when you became Director General. How are you going to pay for those priorities, and also how might they have to adapt in the context where the licence fee may well be frozen for 4 years?
Well, I think the priorities remain the same because they are the levers of value. Yeah, it's really simple. I'm honestly just focused utterly with my senior team on what delivers value to a household. I think of the four levers, different things have different financial impacts. So impartiality clearly is at the core of the BBC. I think whatever your budget is, you're absolutely focused. Now, could we do more in that in terms of investing in things like misinformation units, the reality checks? Of course we could. And there are concerns that I want to make sure that, this is to the earlier questioning, that regional and local newsrooms have the resources to do investigative reporting. We've got the resources to do that. So there are clearly things that should be invested in, and we've put our plan on that. When it comes to content, I think that's where the real action is, in terms of we're seeing hyperinflation in terms of the market for premium content. So Charlotte and the team are having to make some tough choices. We have to decide, and I do think we need investment to make sure we've got that in place. The online online is a similar story. And then finally, the commercial return just helps, which I'm sure we're going to get onto. All of these things are about choices, because the truth of the BBC is we are a mid-scale revenue player at best on the in global terms. We're very big in the UK, but let's not forget, an enterprise of 5 billion, weirdly, is not that big when you look at the players that we've got on the east and the west of us. And I think we have to be very, very focused. And there's no scenario in which we have to make quite tough choices, even if we're invested in, to make sure that we're focused on British content and where we really make a difference. We cannot just keep pushing out. One of the things I've said as a final point is, on the content side, we're probably going to have to make less, but make sure we just ensure the impact is high. Okay. So, I think we're in a demanding situation in terms of the global market and what we need to do.
Okay, Mr.
Okay, we'll come on to a few of those areas very shortly. Just in terms of the £700 million extra investment outside of London, Mr. Grant referred to, you obviously don't know what the settlement's going to be for that period. Is that a guarantee that £700 million is going to be there regardless of what settlement you get?
We assumed just that was literally just mathematically, if you took our current budget at the 50%, 60% level for television, 40, 50 for radio, if you follow me, and just play that across the years. So obviously, everything is welcome to the situation here, but everything is subject to a licence fee settlement. But that is a reasonable number based on our current financing. Yeah, no, it's an interesting pledge to make when you don't know what the settlement will be. But maybe that's why you made it. That's not why I made it. I made it because if you look at drama lead times and you want to change and make sure we're delivering in 24, 25, you've got to get motoring. That's why. Okay. In your discussions with the DCMS, are you looking to increase the borrowing limits, which have been in place, I think, since 2003? Is that something, whether for the PSP side but also for the commercial side, is that something that's holding you back from increasing the revenues, particularly commercially? Indeed. Glyn, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So on the commercial side, we currently have a operational borrowing cap of 350 million. On the public service side, 200 million. These were set many years ago, I think in 2003, so kind of slightly out of date and do need revisiting. I think while we're comfortable with the operational borrowing on the public service side, on the commercial side, to generate further growth, more access to investment capital would be really welcome to compete with the really big players that we've got. And actually, most organisations don't operate with a cap, particularly for them in the commercial space. Their natural cap is how much they're able to raise in the market, whether it's through banks. So 350 million is well supported, and we could raise more in the market if the cap was lifted. So now's a good time to revisit that, and we should do that through the process.
And what's the number that you're pitching for?
Well, so the profit level across the commercial organisation pre-pandemic was around 180 to 190 million. That could support a borrowing level of some 500 million, so 1.5 times the current cap that we have. But, to the extent we grow further, there's potential for having higher levels of borrowing and investment. But I think that's for discussion when we set out and discuss our plans with DCMS.
Okay, thank you. I just want to come on to a bit about content, and the report talks about the high levels of inflation in the entertainment sector and the industry. So given that and decline in licence fee, how sustainable is your current spend on content? Don't know, Mr. Davie, you can take that or pass the message?
No, I can. I mean, it's fairly straightforward because our budget is not that complex. I mean, if you look at the 3.7 billion odd, I mean, we've spent a vast amount of time trying to reduce our overheads to an absolute minimum level. And I know we had work to do, but if you look at the NAO report, it shows, it mentions the fact that we're now into top 25% in terms of comparator organisations. We've now got our overheads down to that aren't being spent on content and distribution to under 5%. So you're right. It is right that you're fairly straight through now onto content and distribution spend. So it's not. I mean, from a business standpoint, there's two variables. There's what you get from the license fee and what you can and the value of that, and then your commercial contribution, which I keep saying we'll get into. We'll get onto, but
we're coming to that next. Don't worry.
Okay, great. So and that returns number that which we can debate in itself. The returns number is the investment that BBC Studios makes into content, as well as the dividend. So you've got those two component parts. You've got the commercial side. Now it's very straightforward that whatever we get on license fee added to the commercial. Now we've made the one we can more. We are more in control of the commercial side. So you'll see hopefully our plans in terms of increases there again, which we might come on to. You just add those two up. What I would say is, if you think the biggest stress for us actually is inflation in the content market and what we can actually afford. The price of premium drama, like for like, I think is up about 9%. It's really, really inflating in the global market. The one thing you want to be at the moment is a scriptwriter or a quality executive producer. I'm not being facetious. I mean, the money and Charlotte. So the question is, how much volume can we deliver and how much scale can we deliver for our money? And I'm confident because I think if you look at the value attributed to the license fee from most households, I think we have a very good story. We have people that we must secure and do some work on to the earlier discussion, but we're holding up pretty well. But final point is, I would rather make slightly less and ensure the quality than spread ourselves too thin. And what I said in my opening speech, we're going to look everywhere and say, what would it take if we made 20% less but made real impact? I think we're going to have to make some of those choices regardless of how good the license fee settlement is.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a number of times making choices and wanting to focus on the real high quality distinctive content. So when the public, the license fee payers, see those plans for only making 80% of your content hours rather than the full 100% that you are at the moment.
I don't think the license fee value is ascribed just by volume. I mean, the truth is, if I gave you 2 or 3 dramas a week that are unmissable, a couple of good documentaries, and one, and you know what that connection with the radio station is like. It's not simply stack it up and do as much as we can.
No, exactly. Sorry, that wasn't.
So in some ways, but you need the universal brief means that you have to have a broad offer. You've got to be broad, but you don't have to make everything in every space. And I think the BBC is clear about that under my leadership with Charlotte and everyone. We do not want to be doing things that are just the same as the market. We want to be distinctive.
Yes, sorry, that was my point about not doing everything. So when will the license fee payer see what you're not going to do? So you can focus on those 3 or 4 shows a week that really count and not do some of the other stuff. When will people know what the other stuff is you're going to stop doing?
Well, over the last few years, we've already, aside from the efficiencies we've been making within our own organisation, in back office, all the various things, we have taken down our volume levels in terms of factual programming and focused on the big documentaries. I could name a few, but Once Upon a Time in Iraq, those other landmark documentaries. Now, this is a balance, isn't it? Because we don't want to move away from the specialist documentaries, the wonders of BBC 4, but sometimes we just can't do everything. And we have cut down some of that volume. We have, and we will continue to. But there's no scenario in which you're not getting a very fulsome offer for your £157.50, in my view, just so we're clear. I don't think we're going to go skinny, but I do think we could be more focused.
And obviously, public service content doesn't have to be produced only by public service broadcasters. So if you've got Netflix or others who move in and start producing wonderful natural history or drama programmes. Do you see it as acceptable for the BBC to step back and say, actually, this is being provided by the market? If we don't need that licence fee for that, we can spend it on something else, or if we don't need that much licence fee, we'll let people keep it in their pocket.
Well, I think we've got to keep setting the standard. I don't think that a BBC that's purely driven by market failure is a good model. I think that would not work, and we would soon unravel in terms of the value we provide to the UK creative economy. I come back to that point I made. We make over 20,000 hours of UK content. The US streamers made over 200 last year. We're doing completely different things. And of course there'll be the occasional landmark natural history documentary or dramas, but we're talking about regional news, local radio stations, orchestral provision, learning provision. We're completely asymmetric to Netflix in so much of what we do. And we must make sure we remain distinctive. I agree with you. We don't want to be in spaces that are just, we're not going to, my view is, how do you take natural history to the next level? We set the standard in natural history around the world. I've sold natural history around the world. It is something to be very proud of. I think we continue with that advantage. And I frankly don't see us stepping back in those areas, because I think we can be world beating.
Okay, I want to come on to the commercial income, which you've been keen to get onto. I mean, at the moment, it's a pretty paltry 6%. How are you going to grow that share? You mentioned the studio's announcement of 30% increase over a period. How are you going to drive that further forward? And what do you think is a healthy percentage that you should be aiming for?
I think I think they say it's paltry. I think the 1.4 billion subsidiary is something that is admired. I'll just allow me 2 minutes of defensiveness, then I'll move on to the main answer, which is a 1.4 billion revenue subsidiary delivering competitive EBITDA margins of 13% is not to be sniffed at. And there's not a public service broadcaster around the world, including all the major territories, who wouldn't bite our arm off for a commercial subsidiary of that size. It's also, although it's 6% of the licence fee, it's highly material in certain genres like drama, like natural history. If you take our natural history landmarks, 70-80% of those are funded by co-productions. So again, you're not going to get a commercial model that funds all of our news provision, some of our local radio provision. So we've got to be careful here. There's only so far we can go. Having said that, I think we've set out, we should be winning share and growing ahead of the market, and there is further potential. I don't quite know where the ceiling is on that. I need to do a bit more work. We need to do a bit more work, but we have a very specific plan as a base plan to grow returns by 30% over the next 5 years. I would like to be going further. Make no mistake, and I think some of the conversations we've had around the levels of borrowing could be material. I think there's also something that this committee particularly is, I suppose, interesting, which is the shape of the cash that comes from that. Because the reason I'm saying that is, if I clearly think we've got potential that in direct-to-consumer services, potentially premium services in places like the States, we've begun it with a successful service with ITV in BritBox. We can definitely expand on that, but that does not necessarily generate cash in the next 5 years. Look at revenue, look at Netflix's cash profile. We couldn't cope with that. So I think there's some choices in terms of how far we go. But to your point, I can definitely see us growing, and we've committed to 30% growth. I think we can go a lot further than that. But I think we also have to be realistic. This is not going to replace the licence fee in the medium term. You know, at that EBITDA level, you'd need a business, 10 times the size, because you're actually, you've got commercial economics there, not licence fee economics.
If you were sat in your own job and you've been asked to produce this 30%, which the NAA told me is a 4.5% annualised growth rate, would you be thinking, oh, they could have pressed me for a bit more? I'd want to be more ambitious than that.
I'd be thinking that's a decent base plan, because it beats the market. The market's not going to go at 4.5, so if I'm beating as a base plan, but I would definitely be sitting there thinking, how can I go further? No doubt. Of course, that's what the commercial subsidiary should be doing.
You don't have a percentage that you think you'd like to see that 6% go to? sort of longer term, maybe over the period of the next?
I think at the moment I'll stick with the 1.5, which it depends. You see, the percentage is dependent on the other bit of the income, isn't it? In terms of what we look at. So I'd like to see a meaning. Sorry, I'm not being opaque. I'd like to see a meaningful increase. I don't know what that is until we get to the licence fee settlement and then regroup with regard to some of the factors we've talked at. And happy to come back and talk about that because I think we can really get into that in some detail. What it doesn't do is materially change the discussion about the licence fee in the short term.
Sure. And how important is the British part of the BBC in maximising that content overseas?
Utterly essential.
Okay. I just wanted to touch on, there was a bit of discussion about flags last week. And I think in your annual report last year, 268 pages, do you know how many Union flags featured in any of the graphics in those glossy pages?
Of all the briefings that I got for this meeting, that was not one of them, I'm afraid.
I think Mr. Wild will help.
Would you care to take a guess?
I have no idea.
Well, it's 0. Do you find that surprising?
No. I think that's a strange metric. I have to say, one of the things I looked at when I came into the building this morning was a Union Jack flying proudly on Broadcasting House, which it does on many, many, many days of the year. I have travelled around the world championing the UK. I sit on the Private Sector Council for the Great Campaign. I don't think there's any problem with the BBC in terms of championing the UK and Britain abroad. We're incredibly proud of it. And if you do wander up Regent Street today, then have a look at the Union Jack flying proudly on top of the BBC.
Always good to see the Union Jack flying. I was just thinking a report of 268 pages about the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. My constituents would expect to see probably more than one flag appearing.
I just don't see it, with respect, I just don't see it as a metric.
Okay, well you may not, but licence fee payers may do. And the Great Campaign you mentioned, I think the Union Jack features pretty prominently in that. In the report you published last week, the BBC across the UK, again, how many images were there of the Union Jack in that?
Well, I could hazard a guess based on where the question is going, but I haven't looked.
Yeah, again, it was none. So maybe in the annual report for this year, perhaps you could include some imagery around the Union flag. Might be welcomed by some of my constituents. To emphasise, we're very proud of being British, and we're happy to. We've been there, out there selling Britain abroad and the UK, and growing the UK creative industries for many years and generating strong exports on the back of it. I'm fiercely proud of it. And I think we've got this, the Union Jack on top of the building flying proudly. No problem at all with that at all. I think that's absolutely what we should be doing. And the UK creative industries is something we should all be incredibly proud of. It's not just about the flag, let's face it, it's about the UK and us getting out there and building business for the country. Yeah, rightly so. That's why last week's episode was so disappointing and the people involved apologised for their reactions. So I think we can probably move on from that now, but I think it's important to acknowledge the issues about the annual report and other points. If we could come on just to, my final of my questions, this section is around the impact of COVID. And you initially forecast that there would be a drop-off in the licence fee, but then that hasn't materialised. Can you just give us an up-to-date position, Mr. Isherwood, on kind of the impact, where the net is in terms of the impact of COVID?
Of course. I mean, in the first lockdown, we had to reset quite significantly the budget across the BBC because we knew that we weren't immune from the sort of pressures of COVID, operationally or financially. At the time, we were, finding it quite difficult to collect licence fee because our outsourced service provider, Capita, had set up a new operations, a lot of people working remotely, and people weren't able to get out and about to pay the licence where they pay at pay points. And in the first quarter, our licence fee collection was down 3 to 4%. And our concern was if lockdown continued, that would continue throughout the rest of the year. but I'm happy to report that hasn't happened, and it's come back strong in the latter part of the year. So as well as that, we have had other impacts on our financial position because of COVID. So the commercial area, which I know you just talked about, has obviously been down, and that's largely because of impact on UK TV advertising market. That's down about 10% in 2020. Again, not as bad as was anticipated. And we've also incurred extra costs through the period through keeping our staff working in COVID-safe environments, and additional costs on production just because of disruption costs, resetting and working in a very different way. And that's had an impact of 60 million. And then the collection of over 75s, the delay, the decision we took, which was absolutely the right decision at the time, to defer it for 2 months, also came at the cost of the BBC of 70 million. So in total terms, our financial impact of COVID was more than 200 million. And we've balanced that through a savings programme we put in place right at the beginning of 125 million. But we have been helped by some of the events that were clearly kind of cancelled because of it. So that's how we broadly sought to balance the books. But some things have shifted. So as you know, the Olympics and both shifted next year. But that's not a saving sense. That's just a movement of an event from one year to the next.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to bounce back to the commercial points. BritBox US, I think it's been going for several years now. I mean, what's that looking like in terms of subscribers, and how you want to see growth in that, and also the revenues and the EBITDA that's kind of being generated from that? Is that potentially, is there much expansion for growth in that market?
Sorry, Glyn, you go for it.
That's okay. So it's been very successful. As you know, it's a partnership with ITV, and it's creating the best of British content overseas. Subscriptions, Tim might be checking them. I think it's approaching 2 million in terms of number of subscribers in the US. It is already profitable, so while it's a long-term play, and the profits are being used to fund rollout in new territories, and we're really confident it will continue to grow.
And what's your ambition for the UK? I was going to say variant, but version might be a better word.
So the UK again, it's a joint venture with ITV. It's mostly been run with them. We do have a small equity stake in the business. It's reached subscribers of 500,000 so far, which ITV published last week.
And what's your ambition for that over the sort of next 5 years in terms of users?
I think it comes down to agree with ITV and how much real content that goes into it, which is unique. The continued supply of archive content to the proposition as well. But I know that ITV particularly are looking to increase that substantially. And they're not sort of disclosing numbers at the moment, but looking for a healthy level of growth because these subscription services are growing quite rapidly.
Just in terms of the archive, you mentioned that. What proportion of the archive has been released in various forms, and to what extent is it sort of ready, more of it to be released, if you see what I mean, if you need to digitise or whatever? And where do you see that in terms of the strategy going forward?
There's always been a healthy market in the UK for a secondary programme that's been originally paid and funded by the licence fee to then give access to archive programming, and that can be done either through subscription services like BritBox or indeed our own commercial subsidiary UK TV, which is an advertising run business. As far as possible, we seek to obviously digitise all our archive, and so where it is uniquely used and it's not in digital form, we'll then digitise it so that it can be used. And we are mostly through the way that now, and as you can sort of see, there's a strong demand for heritage BBC programming played out on a number of platforms.
I think if I may, Glyn, I think it's really interesting is I think it's such a good question because we've wrestled with it into how far we can go. So the truth is it's very dependent by genre. So when we've done a huge deal with Discovery where that natural history archive, you can see it's searchable, interesting. There is, if I'm just very transparent, a slight problem in that most of the archive, of course, hasn't been monetised because most of it is actually not whether it's live programming, whether it's factual, but it's not. We have challenges in terms of what's the right monetization model for that, and we've got to keep considering that, because I think digital may give us some opportunities there. But I do think when it comes to older content that is monetizable, we're doing a pretty good job with UK TV. Remember, we've got a £500 million sales business around the world based on, our content at a decent margin. And the problem, by the way, is if we went to a global iPlayer or anything, is you have to give up on that, go cold turkey on that revenue. So that's the balance. I think we constantly evaluate it. I'm very pleased with where BritBox has got, by the way. I mean, this is hard yards in the US. It's very hard. We can't give away the numbers because we're in a joint venture, it's commercially, but let's just say the economics are good, very good. And to get to, heading towards 2 million subscribers is really good progress from which we can build. I've said publicly I'm interested in what are the potential for further premium products in the States, like news, like other things, where we can look at direct to consumer and use digital to get more revenue. I think that remains an exciting area of opportunity for the commercial service, and an area where we could also invest capital and get other partners involved. We did that in linear television with AMC Networks. I think there's some real potential there.
You've obviously got a very good commercial pedigree and been successful. Do you think that's wide enough across the BBC in terms of driving forward the commercial side, or do you need to do more to bring in the commercial skills?
We need to keep going, of course. I've just hired a chief operating officer who ran a big chunk of Centrica, who is driven, understands the business world. I think we are much more externally driven than we have been historically. I think the challenge for us in terms of talent, in terms of the leadership, is you have to be able to blend that editorial skills with the commercial nous and grip. And I think that's the balance I'm trying to get. Actually, I think from a UK perspective, we need to develop more executives who've got both sides of that. And that's what the BBC can do. But you're right, I think we're in the midst of significant cultural change. There's not a lot of people on my top team who I don't believe are externally focused and couldn't go into the market and be significantly in demand. I think I'm in danger of being a long in the tooth BBC executive after 15 odd years, but I think we definitely want people, and I hire on people who get the outside world and really understand the operational grip needed and the detail of economics to get commercial return alongside the public return. So absolutely a good challenge. We're on our way, I think.
Okay, just one final one for me, Chair, in this section. Mr. Isherwood, did BBC furlough any staff during the pandemic?
No, I mean, on one side, on studios, they had an application for furlough, but then returned and didn't access that. But on the public service side, we did run a mirror scheme for a number of freelancers to sort of offer strong support for many of those people who have worked quite closely with the BBC and had pre-booked scheduled working arrangements for the BBC.
Okay,
on studios, we applied, but because the team have done such a good job of mitigating COVID and will deliver, I think, reasonable performance.
So
we didn't need it.
Can I just check, Mr. Isherwood, you talked about having a shadow scheme, so that means what was funded by the BBC for those freelancers?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it was appropriate for those people who we'd scheduled to book.
Okay, so it was, but just to be clear, it was just the people who were scheduled, so not your. So, where did, for example, where would a freelance makeup artist have been in that if they were doing a news programme and they were furloughed? Were they furloughed?
So no, for most people, I mean, we did continue working across many areas of lockdown, but there were people who had pre-booked work which had to be ceased, and we either honoured contract, or indeed for people who had regular work normally throughout that period, for a 3-month period, we operated a scheme where we gave them a contribution in line with a furlough payment. Okay, so you mirrored furlough but funded out of your own funds. Can you tell us what that cost? It was just above £1 million in total. Okay, thank you. And can I just before I go back to Mr. Wild, who's going to probe further on some of the finances, we've had a lot of talk about the bigger picture stuff, but I wondered perhaps Mr. Davie or Mr. Isherwood, if you could just drill down and give me some specifics of what you've got. This big savings target of £1 billion a year. You've got this ambitious plan to move a lot of work out of London.
You've seen your payroll increase by 9%, I think it is, over the last 5 years or so. So you've got a lot going on. Can you give us some specific examples of what you're not going to do in order to make those savings? We've heard a lot about the positives of what you are going to do, but
Sure.
where are the cuts going to hit?
Thank you, Chair. It's a good question. I'll hand to Mr. Isherwood in a minute. You will note that I made public that by the end of the year we'll be 900 people smaller as a public service, which is the first time in a number of years. I just note that headcount will be significantly smaller in the BBC. So a direct answer to your question is we're going to have a lot less people. Yeah. Okay. And I think that we need to do that. Glyn, you may want to talk about other things we're doing in terms of driving out cost. Because not all the things we talked about are incremental. They're about reshaping the money. But we also, your challenge is right. We also need to see where we're cutting.
Exactly. We need some specifics, please. It would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I've given you one on the numbers.
Thank you,
the
Mr. Isherwood,
which is hard. Yeah. Glyn, do you want to add anything?
Yes, we've got existing savings programme goes out to March 22, and we've made good progress on that. So by the end of this year, we'll be more than £800 million through that. We're continuing to make the headcount savings. So the numbers that Mr. Davies referred to will save us approaching £60 million a year, because actually, although our headcount reduces more than 900 this year, there's still a tail end of a high level reduction through the voluntary redundancy programme we've had in place all year round. We've also had a recruitment freeze, so our headcount will come down again next year. Through our technology investment, we drive a lot of savings. So we are constantly looking for new technology. So we've restacked how we operate our technology, which has driven a lot of savings and simplified those contracts so they're more flexible in how they operate. So they're not just standard costs. We've also put systems in place that allow us to operate more flexibly as a business. And actually, through operation of COVID, and we've learned quite a lot. I mean, through most of the time, we've operated with less than 15% of our staff in offices. So we are absolutely embracing agile and what would I guess now call blended working. We think that gives us an opportunity, and this is something that staff are keen to explore. It gives us an opportunity potentially to use our offices more efficiently, perhaps have less of them in the future, like many organisations. So those are a few of the specifics, but there are more as well.
Okay, can I just check on the headcount issue number? How many are journalists and how many are managers? Roughly, I mean, can you give us a breakdown?
Yeah, so of the number that Mr. Davie referred to, I mean, about half are from across the nations and regions. A lot of those are what we call, I suppose, support functions, back office functions, but there are a number of people who are frontline. Across our news, there's about 150, and then the remainder are support functions, whether that's through digital and technology or corporate overhead areas. I mean, I have to say that, you know, it's true that because we made such a strong progress in our savings, and because we do have, you know, top quartile overheads in terms of comparison with other media organisations, we are having more increasingly to look at savings in, I suppose, what would traditionally be called front office, journalistic skills, those kind of areas, because we are cutting, you know, a bit to the bone on the back office areas now. Okay,
but you're also moving some of your substantial amount of your operations outside of London. So are you going to rehire people? How do you cut the cloth accordingly? I'm just a bit puzzled as to how you match the two, Mr. Isherwood.
Well, we've already put in place a significant change. So now we have a commitment to have some of our radio services out of London, and also some of the TV production done in other places. So in some cases, we will look for further efficiencies in how we do that, and the way that we are configuring news at the moment to work on a story-led basis, so we get the same level of news but more productively created and going further across multiple platforms gives us further efficiency to go for. But inevitably, when a third of our cost base is people, it's quite difficult to make savings without impacting on the number of people engaged across the organisation.
Okay, final from me for now.
Mr.
Davie.
Sorry, very specifically, Chair, the changes are not inflationary in that regard. They have some temporary costs, but in the news operation with network news, we're looking at, I think, 210 roles moving outside the M25. Now, that is not immediate. You do it over the next couple of years and you work that through. Now, we've got a number of challenges in that, but it's fairly standard, if I may, relocation work in terms of any organisation would undertake. We're not talking about hiring incrementally in many of the changes we're talking about. There are a couple of areas where we'll continue to look to get efficiencies more generally, and they're very contained. So we've looked at how we could do more digital journalists in local and the apprenticeships. And they're the areas where we need to look at our overall financing over the next 5 years and see how we go. But most of this is standard relocation, and we have a degree of churn within the organisation anyway. Sensible planning. I think this is well within the bounds of, if I'm honest, normal business.
Okay, well, I think we're just puzzling how it matches up, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Wilde, who's good at the maths. Over to you, Mr. Wilde.
Well, I hopefully get a bit more light here. In the report, it talks about the target, a bit savings target increasing to £1 billion. Mr. Isherwood, by the end of this year, did you say that you were 800 million? Have I misunderstood your answer?
So at the beginning of the Charter, we set out a target of 800 million by March 22. For a number of reasons, we've had to increase that target over time. At the end of last financial year, we delivered 618 million. I'm confident that we're going to deliver at least another 200 million this year, so we'll be over 800 million.
Okay, and how clear is your line of sight of getting the final 200 million? Obviously, efficiency targets, they get harder as you get nearer to the target. So we have the MOD in here, they have wedges against things, but they don't have any specific plans. Have you got specific plans to deliver that 200 million?
We've got, so this year, because of the addition of COVID savings, where we've had to move very quickly, we have good line of sight on next year because we've just been through a detailed budget process. And actually, a lot of the savings are run rate savings from actions taken this year. So while we've reduced the headcount this year by 900 and 900 people exit the organisation by the end of March, most of the saving of that counts towards next year's total.
Okay, but are you continuing looking for further efficiencies?
Yeah, I mean,
as part of business.
We are relentless in terms of looking for further production efficiencies, and actually part of the work that we've done and presented to DCMS out to the Charter is to continue to have a level of efficiency built in going through that period as well, so out to 27. We have had a lot of success. We've been delivering 2% plus annual efficiency each year. I think a government benchmark from areas that we've looked at is broadly 1%. We'd like to continue to beat that 1% as we go out to the end of the Charter.
And as Mr. Davie's made the point, and the report makes the point that your back office sort of running costs is a fairly small proportion of the budget. So is there a danger that the content budget has to be looked at and driving efficiencies when you're up against the inflationary costs that you've described in terms of some of the types of content?
Yeah. There's a very real danger, absolutely. I mean, it's utterly transparent, our budget. I think, by the way, I think to Glyn's point, we have pretty clean sight to March 22. And I actually think the BBC gets understandable pressure on this, but to have delivered over 2% through the whole period is pretty strong work. I think you are seeing that degrade slightly to the 1.6% in the last years because of just the enormity of what we're trying to do. And it goes exactly to your point, which is I then begin to have to make quite tough choices around content. So now I would never want to be in an organisation that isn't looking for a decent level of efficiency. And as has been said earlier, I think we're seeing comparable benchmarks commercially and within government of getting to about 1%. I'd like to keep seeing us deliver that kind of level. And I think you can always find that. Just keep pushing. But once you get to a certain level, the BBC budget is very clear. You begin to impact the newsroom and the content. I mean, it's inescapable. That's not where I want to be, but that's where our economics are.
And how do you decide those trade-offs between your point about universality of content and giving something for everyone, then also distinctive content which may have a more discrete audience? Where do you fall on that balance?
No, I'm smiling because that is the joy of this job. And it's what makes it unique versus a commercial job where you have one metric, which is profit. So the decision-making becomes quite clear. Welcome to the joys of the tightrope we walk. I think that the metric I'm trying to introduce with the top team is audience value in the round. So something might be small, but it's got to have a deep connection with its audience. So some of the radio services or some of they're not the biggest, but they have a deep connection and they really mean something to someone in terms of the value for their license fee. And I think that is going to be our key metric. I say this with slightly heavy heart. It's not enough just to say that is a good piece of work or it fits or it has merit. I think we'll have to make choices that it not only has merit, but it delivers value to audiences and delivers on its targets. I am not trying to commercialise the BBC in that. It's a different metric. But your question is extremely well put. The truth is we have to land as much as possible in the Venn diagrams, the centre of the Venn diagram between those two positions. So if you take Blue Planet or you take Bite Size, the obvious examples which the Director General would give you, they're the things that do both. Yeah. So I want more in the middle ground where you've got things of some scale, but also delivering what is clearly special and no one else would do. That's the game. You're trying to maximise the percentage of things to get your return. But no, it's an extremely well-put question, actually.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass back to you, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Richard Holden, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much indeed, Chair. Just on this redundancies point that you've made, Mr. Davie, paragraph 2.9 of the report says that a significant number of staff did express an interest in voluntary redundancy. Was that more than you needed for expressing an interest in actually leaving the organisation?
Yeah, let me give you. We had 2,189 received. We had 1,034 accepted. In 2021, that was 798. 22 will be 236. That's where we were. So we had more. We had to make some choices.
So you had more than twice the number of people applied than you actually took voluntary redundancy then?
Yeah, although you've got to be. They put in requests, as I understand it, to see what their options would be and see what it would look like. So I wouldn't take that as everyone wanting to just walk out the door. That was applications that were then discussed.
Right. Okay. And just over to you, Mr. Isherwood. There's a lot of concern, obviously, about where this headcount is actually leaving the organisation from around the country. Is that where are these positions leaving them from, and was there a geographical distribution?
Well, just to add to what Mr. Davie was saying, obviously the reason the number of applications is higher than those accepted, we had to work through in real detail around where we could take them. Because what we didn't want to do is take people's applications for redundancy and put extra pressure and stress on teams. So we had to work quite closely with teams around how work can be redistributed, what we might stop in doing that. And that resulted in the 1,000 plus that were able to accept. So some people, although they might want to leave the organisation, weren't allowed to accept their redundancy. I stated earlier the broad breakdown of where those roles came from, and some of those, more than 400, did come from nations and regions, which was fulfilling an already existing programme of change. And I think you just need to reflect on, because we've taken so much headcount and numbers out of the corporate overhead over a number of years, it was inevitable that some of those savings would have to come from other areas, including news and some of the functions across nations and regions. But it's at no higher proportion than anything else we've taken out in other parts of the organisation. Because those are people-heavy parts of the organisation, understandably their savings are reflected in a reduction in headcount, and that's unavoidable.
And one of the most valuable things I know to my constituents is certainly our regional news coverage, because it really does provide that proper link. It's probably the only real output that we see from the northeast. But I'm just interested in the broader switch that you've got. So you're moving from an issues-based news agenda to follow the story. Mr. Davie, if you're doing that, surely that's going to be across nations and regions. Are you not in danger of basically having to fire and rehire people in the organisation in order to meet that different news cycle that you're now pushing towards?
Yeah, it's a fair challenge. I think it's more about, forgive the corporate word, but reshaping our resources that we've got, as opposed to enormous amounts of new people. I'll explain what I mean by that. I think the story teams, by the way, are as simple. I mean, there's not a newsroom in the world that isn't going through enormous change, revolution. I mean, it's traumatic in terms of talk to any of the newspapers, what they're going through, talk to any media company. What we've decided to do is, and this is sensitive, which is you've got all those teams that are working on television and online, is we believe that actually, and we're often criticised, to be fair, in terms of having too many reporters going through the same story, all of that. The story team is designed to pull that together while allowing the programme still to have their different flavours, whether that be PM or the 6.
No, I understand that, Davie, but in answer to my question, you're switching you want more digital content from the regions. That's one thing you've mentioned just before to Mr. Wild. Are you not going to be literally firing some people under voluntary redundancy from one part of the organisation, only to potentially have to rehire them to do this new digital content that you're pushing?
To be clear, I'm not being funny. We're not firing anyone if they're taking voluntary redundancy.
Right, okay. No, in fact, no, you're not. You're actually paying them a lot more because you're giving them voluntary redundancy. So, in answer to my question, which is realistically about where you're deploying resources, is there a danger that the organisation, the BBC, is going to be losing people in one area with voluntary redundancy packages just to rehire them in a separate area down the line?
I think Mr. Isherwood was shaking. Bring Mr. Davie, then Mr. Isherwood can come in on that as well. Mr. Davie.
I think the risks are low in that regard, although I take the point, because those journalists we're trying to bring in are the digital journalists, the digital skills, the apprenticeships. I think they're a different cadre of individuals. I also think the BBC does need to be in a position where it's training, bringing people in skills-wise, and I think that's where the opportunity lies, not in rehiring people who have wanted to leave the organisation, bluntly.
Fair enough, Mr. Davie. Mr. Isherwood?
It's a question of, because we've driven out the right level of efficiency from our nations and regions and taken voluntary redundancy. Tim Davie's right, we are hiring a different set of skills in different parts, so we can have specialist news teams in different parts of the country running very specific areas of the news agenda. That's different to more generic local journalists. So I think it's...
But if you're story focused, how can you be more specific? If you're switching from, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. If you're moving from content which is on, following an issue to following a story, surely the general story is what you're after, Mr. Isherwood.
No, so we can have specialist news teams. So, for example, climate change and environment is going to be based in Cardiff. Technology is going to be based in Glasgow. Those are not specifically regional stories. Those are national stories and coordinated news team that run a particular news agenda from that locality. Those will be new people, different people for those who've taken voluntary redundancy, who worked on local news stories. It's an opportunity to reshape and refresh the team and bring in different news stories.
Well, thanks, Mr. Isherwood. I remain slightly unconvinced by that, but back to you.
Okay, I think we're certainly going to keep a close eye on the numbers, given the cost of redundancies and the people who are going. And over to Mr. James Wild again.
Thank you, Chair. The report talks about a couple of projects where the costs have significantly been above the budgeted figure, namely the EastEnders set and the campaign management system for licence fee, which you spoke about a little bit earlier, Mr. Isherwood. What changes have you made to governance to try and prevent similar cost growth happening on other projects?
So it's worth at the very start putting this into context. So the NAO rightly point out a couple of projects which have been more challenging. I mean, firstly, we take on very challenging projects because we want to move the agenda of the BBC forward. And since 2012, we've done 29 of these large-scale projects that we call on our critical project list. Of that, 9%, on average, they've been 9% below budget, delivered 1.28 billion of benefits, and the cost-benefit to ratio has been £2.18 for every pound that we've done. So we have had large majority of successful projects, but we've had challenges on a few of these, as has been pointed out by the NEO. So each project now has a executive champion, has a project sponsor, and has a programme director. We've set up regular assurance programmes, in part our project management office has representation on each of the projects now to make sure we have continual feedback to the board, and each month the BBC board receives an update a short update on the projects that are currently in train. So the oversight, the responsibility has increased quite significantly over the last few years, and we're a learning organisation. We continue to make improvements in this place. Are we happy that we've had to write off some cost of these projects? Of course we're not, and we want to do better, and we strive to do that. But there's good, strong oversight by Audit Risk Committee, and in terms of E20 and the EastEnders set, we wrote to the committee in October, as we now do annually, to give you a regular update of how that's progressing.
And where are we in terms of the EastEnders project, in terms of expected cost and completion date?
So I have to say the total costs are on budget, which I know was reset a number of years ago. It's in two parts. So the front lot, which is by far and away the largest part, is on track to complete this year. It will be handed back over to the production team. The smaller bit, which is called the back lot, which will be built on the existing set of where EastEnders is at the moment. We've got a concept design agreed. Sensibly, we paused the build of that because we wanted budget certainty on the building of the front lot, which we've done, but also not launch in and go through a tender process in a time where there's quite a lot of challenges around launching build projects. So we've paused that, but as soon as that restarts, then we'll have a completion finish date for that. But we're absolutely committed to keeping this within the budget that we have.
Okay, I think probably a final one for me on this section. In terms of the wider portfolio of projects, which are the two that give you the most concern? Which ones are you worried about?
I think we have to think quite carefully just now around having set out our plans across the UK, how we make sure that we deliver on those plans and really establish the benefit for audiences across the UK, and having had the commitment, the announcements so far, we're now at the foothills of thinking about the governance around how we deliver those things. So that's one thing I'd call out. I think some of the areas just around technology projects are more and more difficult, and I think we have to take those on. And I think as we rethink about the future, we're going to have to draw more on technology. So I think areas around that are notoriously complex, as was demonstrated with the campaign management system.
Is there a specific project in that space that you're thinking of?
No, I think we're looking at a number of areas of that around just enterprise systems. So we have an existing SAP system, and at some point we'll have to take on the challenge of upgrading and renewing that, and that's potentially a significant change, because what we want to do is access the benefits of running a much more refined enterprise management system, and that doesn't come without its challenges.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wild. Now over to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. Over to you, Sir Geoffrey.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Davie. Picking up on Mr. Wilde's point about governance, we've talked this afternoon quite a bit about the midterm licence review, but we haven't talked at all about Ofcom review. How do you know that the changes that you're proposing are going to be compatible with what Ofcom might require you to do?
Well, again, in terms of what we're responding to is what's set out in the Charter as our purposes and our guidelines. I mean, I think now the conversation specifically with regard to Ofcom is then, do we feel any of our proposals? Obviously, they'll have to look at all of our proposals, whether that be BBC Three or any of the other things they wish to do as a regulator. I think in broad terms, the last annual report and the discussions with Ofcom around our push, it was an earlier discussion about how do we make sure we're delivering to young audiences. I think absolutely that is central to our plans and what we're doing. So I'm hoping that responds to the Ofcom challenge. The other thing is, I think that we are appropriately considering the environment in which we exist and making sure that what we do is highly distinctive and different to where the market is going, and we're doing it in our own way. Now, that I can't answer for Ofcom, but I can't see anything in our plans that isn't in line with where the BBC should be going and what it needs to do to remain distinctive in the market. You may have a different view, but that's where I am.
Okay, Sir Geoffrey, back to you.
So have you had any informal discussions with Ofcom to know where they're likely to come out in their review and to make sure that these quite significant changes that you've announced this week are going to be compatible?
Well, I think in terms of the significant changes this week, where we make our content and where it's in terms of the most of what we've been talking about this week, which is only one part of what we're doing, is making sure our supply base is sitting around the UK. We've got very good portrayal. We've got money outside, current money. And I know, and I understand, by the way, the committee's concerned about is this new money, but I just repeat, this is how we would spend current budgets to make sure we're driving audience value on portrayal and representation. Now, clearly, we have a significant number of quotas around genre, around channel licenses, but in terms of what we're talking about, unless I'm missing something, that is something that I think sits alongside what the Ofcom regime. And there are certain things that we've announced in recent weeks, such as BBC Three on linear, where Ofcom will have to take a look at. But we're not talking about expansion of scope in anything we've really talked about. So I'm hoping that we can have a constructive and good dialogue with Ofcom on that. I think there's a separate thing, which is the PSB reviews that are happening, where I think we, together with Ofcom, to your point, are having discussions and we input around, topics like prominence for public service broadcasting, which I think are absolutely grade one issues of, where we go in terms of what prominence we give to public service broadcasting in the future, how we support platforms. We've had free views and the free sats in the past. What type of platforms we're going to have, what kind of partnerships among the public service broadcasters. These are the things that I think are really important to the ecology of the UK media market. And that's where I think Ofcom will be very helpful in terms of setting the right regulatory framework for these things.
Thank you very much for that very full answer. Can I ask you, Mr. Isherwood, just to make sure that you've got a joined-up policy? In these changes you've announced this week, you're going to need to relocate quite a lot of real estate. Now, in your real estate portfolio, you've done quite a lot of sales and leasebacks, complicated deals recently. Are you going to find yourselves in a position where you've actually sold off the ownership of a property, but still rent it back on a lease, and then you're going to need to relocate somewhere else? Is the policy on property joined up?
We have a number of legacy deals that were put in place some time ago around sale leaseback arrangements. Those do exist on a couple of properties in London, but also in Pacific Quay in Scotland. The most significant one is New Broadcasting House, which is BBC HQ. We have no plans to exit that, indeed have a very long-term lease on that building, and that's where the the large investment around our news operation has been made, and it has that sort of technology resilience. So I don't think we're going to find ourselves in that situation, but where we have excess property, we will seek to sublet that where we can.
Thank you. I think I'll leave it for there now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for now, Sir Geoffrey. Back to Gareth Bacon, MP. Mr. Bacon, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's a question to Mr. Davie, and it's about employee remuneration costs. The NAO in their report in paragraph 2.17 note that the increase in remuneration costs of the BBC between 15-16 and 19-20 went up in real terms by 9%, or £1.5 billion, compared to employee growth in the same period of 7%. And I think in a previous Public Accounts Committee report, it was noted that the reason for the increase in remuneration or the difference between the increase in staffing and remuneration, was because the BBC were trying to address fairness, transparency and consistency issues. And I seem to recall at the time there being some fairly well publicised gender pay gap issues, which I think the BBC were attempting to address. In February of 2019, the BBC calculated that the changes that they would make going forward would produce a net saving of £4.9 million to the pay bill over the 7 years between 17 and 23, which is 0.1% of the overall total staff pay bill over that period. Do you think you could have been a bit more ambitious on that?
I don't know. I'd have to get into some of the detail. I mean, Glyn's waving, so he might be able to give a more specific answer than that. Glyn?
So the committee will know from the report that it had on managing the BBC's pay bill that the BBC undertook a significant amount of pay reform across a number of years. Those reforms were put in place to align old allowances and legacy allowances, bring people up to a minimum standard, and put in place a real transparent way of managing pay across the organisation. And in doing that, we had to make agreement with unions around what those changes were, and they were always done around making sure that we had centrally controlled and aligned pay processes that weren't done around saving money per se. And actually, as you know, that over the last 2 years, we have had some pay, but we've had real pay restraint over the BBC over many years, and we've had to put in place a number of fair pay adjustments, which was absolutely the right thing to do. And you know, this situation changes quite substantially now because we're in a sort of period where we are significantly reducing headcount. So our pay bill is now coming down, and that's made easier because we can do have comparative market-related pay for everybody in the organisation.
Yeah, I think it was because, trade unions are not famous for accepting pay reductions. I think that's probably fair to say. So I'm not surprised the trade unions agree with what you've done. But you are against a time where your costs are needing to be reduced in order to meet your challenges going forward. And so the reason for the question was, is 0.1% a total reduction up until 2023 ambitious enough? Do you think that are you going to end up where you need to be, or are you going to have to find further savings in this area?
Well, I think the 0.1% reduction was specifically in relation to those reforms that agreed with unions. Of course, we're looking at ways that we can reshape the organisation.
Yeah, but that was a historic thing that you personally, the BBC had got itself into. Nobody forced there to be a discrepancy in pay between men and women, did they?
I think since that point, you've got to reflect on, during the last year, we've put in place a pay freeze for all senior managers. We haven't given an annual pay review, so we have had, a significant savings. Part of our plans going forward is to bring in up to 1,000 apprentices each year across the BBC. We're making incredible efforts to reshape the organisation, and at the same time, we've got massive cost pressures in terms of digital skills, which are in high demand. We have people, very high turnover around those kind of areas, around talented commissioners. We're losing people all the time to other areas. So we've got the twin track of intense competitive cost pressure. At the same time, we're trying to keep our pay levels at a reasonable level and in line with inflation. And I think we've done a good job on it.
But you would accept that it's a reasonable question to ask, given that the bulk of your income comes from a compulsory licence fee?
Yeah, and our record on pay has been tremendous. I mean, our number of senior managers has halved over the last 10 years. And in terms of proportion, it's 1.5% of the total staff base. That's, the market norm is about 2.3%. So I think we're very strong in terms of that level. And of course, the shape will change over time. We've got more opportunities to do that, and we're trying hard to do that. We're absolutely aware of our income coming from licence fee payers, which is why we take, the actions that we take.
Can I just say that it was only by the timing of elections which let the BBC off the hook of a hearing that we'd done on detailed preparation for about your pay issues, and there are still discrepancies. The discrepancies that were very public were between men and women, particularly senior talent and senior presenters. But there was also a discrepancy, very marked, between black and minority ethnic staff and white staff, generally speaking. I mean, I paraphrase for ease and speed. But there were a number of issues in your payroll. Do you think, Mr. Isherwood, you've now really got to grips with that? And as Mr. Bacon says, this is largely public funded. It's right, surely, that you're setting the lead in making sure that your pay setup is proper and fair, and as well as good value.
Okay, so you're right, we didn't have the session on the managing BBC's pay bill, but let me just quote you what the NAO said. They said, it's a considerable achievement that the BBC has now stabilised pay ranges that are centrally controlled, systematically benchmarked and market informed. And that's what the NAO said. So we do have pay set at the right level. In doing that, going through that, clearly that highlighted a number of anomalies. And we've had, we've invited people to come forward and question their pay. We have unique, unprecedented transparency around pay in this organisation now. People sit within a clear pay range. We have a people view system so that people can see where they sit within the cohort of people who are doing a similar job in the pay range. There's clear progression in terms of how people move from grade to grade. And then we've dealt with, as this committee knows, more than 1,300 queries around pay, and we've sought to resolve those over a period of time and put in a substantial amount of effort, a robust system to deal with those. And of the 1,300 plus queries, we have 7 remaining that we're dealing with. That's a substantial effort to get this right. And I think, we are industry leading in terms of the efforts that we've put into this space.
Thank you. It's quite helpful just to wrap up the session that we never had, which is was helpful. Can I just check before I throw back to Mr. Bacon on apprenticeships? I think 7.4 million of your budget goes to the apprenticeship levy. Are you spending any additional money on apprenticeships? I think it's probably from the figures. The maths roughly means that you're adding on two-thirds of your own money to buy more apprentices. Is that right, roughly?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you exactly, but we do have to employ our own money, and of course there's the sort of money in running the scheme and providing the training as well. So it's not just all coming through the actual levy. Okay, and can I just check how many of those apprentices end up in full-time jobs with the BBC? Because apprenticeships are very good, but really what we want is a job at the end of it. Do you know what percentage turn into permanent fixtures? I don't have the exact percentage of that, and it's a high proportion. Where we bring people in to do production training schemes, because it's a very fluid market, I know that what happens is we don't offer permanent contracts at the end, and they genuinely go off and work in the industry. To the extent we do have production available for them, then we do keep them. So there's less proportion in that area, but around the corporate and support areas, it's a high proportion that we try and maintain. Thank you. Back to Mr. Bacon. Sorry, Mr. Bacon, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Isherwood. How much income do you now expect to bring in with the ending of free licences for most of the over 75s?
So the step down in income from DWP was at its lowest level last year, so it was at 253 million. This year, I think we've had a successful program collection income. We expect to collect 86% of licences from over 75s of those who are able to pay outside pension credit. So in numbers terms, that's about 2.7 million pensioners, and then on top of that, we've got about 770,000 who've applied for pension credit. So our broadly our income from over 75s this year will be over 400 million in the end.
Okay. And what's the current estimate for the implementation? Because you've had to set up a new scheme, haven't you, to do this?
We have, and it's been, incredibly complicated. I mean, reaching out to 4.2 million people over 75. I mean, it's almost a kind of a social outreach program. We've had to be incredibly sensitive about how we put systems in place to allow people to engage and deal with them sensitively, whether they're on the call centre or online or visiting. And then right through the middle of that, obviously we had the global pandemic, so we had to revisit how we put that together to make sure it was COVID safe, so that people didn't have to leave their home to pay the licence fee. And that's gone really well. We estimate, we know our cost, our final cost of implementing will be in the order of 65 million.
Okay, and is that 65 million coming off the 400 million figure that you gave me, or is that the net figure?
No, it's a separate figure. So the amount that we take in will be 400, and then there's cost of setting up the program, which was 65, which to an extent is one-off implementation cost in this year. So it's across technology, because we put in a 75 plus payment system, so that people can pay in regular payments rather than one-off. And we also had to increase a number of call centre operators, as well as make the technology changes and deal with all the communications that were required during that period.
So how much of that do you think is going to be just a one-off cost? I mean, if you put in a call centre, will you need to retain that or not?
Yeah, so as we've done it through the same provider capita, obviously it provides synergies going forward. So we've had our arrangements with capita for a number of years on the existing contract. As we go forward and negotiate a new contract, we'll have to look at what efficiencies can be made across the piece. So it will be well below the 65 million, because obviously a lot of that was one-off costs in year.
Okay, so this year there'll be a 65 million bite that's taken out of the 400 million or thereabouts. Correct. Going forward, that should reduce substantially.
Correct.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll finish my section.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacon. Back to Peter Grant, MP. Over to you, Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Can I come to Ms. Moore first? I want to follow up some of the discussion earlier on about the commercialisation of some aspects of the BBC's work, and in particular, where there are programmes such as documentaries or dramas that are made primarily for airing on the BBC, but with a view to marketing them internationally afterwards. I find it quite obvious, especially with documentaries. You watch an hour-long documentary and you can see where the gaps are being put, or advert breaks, and they're sold to other broadcasters. To what extent do you tailor the content of a BBC programme with an eye to the fact that you want to be able to sell it to other networks?
No, absolutely not. That's my job, Mr. Grant, is not to do that. My job is to get the very best content for the audiences for the BBC. So I don't. Obviously, the suppliers for that programme, I'm sure, will be thinking about how they can maximise their revenue in their own way. So, but from my point of view, when we commission something, and obviously in discussion with co-production partners, because obviously some of our shows, particularly dramas, but increasingly comedy and some factual, and of course natural history is a big co-production area for us. Obviously, depending on the co-producers, obviously they will have their needs, but primarily the shows are commissioned by us, and therefore editorially we take the lead, and that's not something that I have to take into consideration. It's one of the great privileges that I'm first and foremost thinking of a UK audience.
So you're saying, in effect, that there are examples where a programme that first airs on the BBC appears to have been made for advert breaks, by saying that either it's been commissioned from somebody else who may have then want to sell it, alternatively it's been co-commissioned, and each of the co-commissioners has had their own input to it.
I imagine the only place that I'd be very interested to know what those were, but I imagine it might be acquisitions, because obviously we do have acquisitions which allows our audience to find content that perhaps they wouldn't see otherwise from other broadcasters. So it might be that you're referring to that, and in which case we make it available to our audience without ad breaks, and we take out the ad break cuts and fade to blacks. But that really is an acquisition. I don't think that would ever be the case on any of our own content, and certainly not with the co-productions, actually. I don't know of anyone where that's been the case.
Certainly, I'd say, Charlotte, having run BBC Studios, the biggest supplier to the BBC, I've never once provided something to BBC Public Service and thought about ad breaks, ever. So I'd love to hear the example, because it must be an acquisition. We would never do that. I mean, we absolutely want to do things that deliver for BBC Public Service audiences. That's non-negotiable.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Ms Moore, I'm not sure whether this falls in your area of responsibility. I want to look at essentially the World Service and the BBC's obligations to worldwide broadcasting. The Charter requires the BBC to reflect the United Kingdom, its culture and values to the world. Who decides what UK values and culture actually means?
I don't think that is a question for me if it's about World Service, I'm afraid.
Okay. Yeah, so that is the World Service is operated by the news division with some outstanding editorial editors who make their call in terms of the programming across different genres on World Service. So it is Jamie Angus, who currently runs World Service specifically, and those editors, frankly, in the same way they're doing in any of the BBC services, are choosing, what's the best in terms of our cultural output, our news output. This is editorial, it's editors as well as science here. They are deciding how to fulfil their mission as the World Service. And obviously that is funded by the 254 million within the licence fee. And then we have the 86 million that comes on top of that from FCDO for the language services. But the answer to your question is that is run by within the news division very well, and that they make the decisions on what editorially goes on there in line with their charter obligations.
Mr. Grant?
So if an individual viewer, for example, thought that content in the World Service didn't properly reflect what they believe to be UK values and culture, would that be a question for the BBC to deal with, and if necessary, would it go to Ofcom in the same way as a complaint of the domestic?
I think it'll be dealt with. I think absolutely. Come to us, and then you work through that complaint in the normal process as you go through the stages. And if it's not satisfied, it goes further up to the regulator. But I would hope that that would be feedback that, in the first instance, through the system, would be responded to by the World Service. I mean, for what it's worth, I'd love to hear the feedback, because I think we're always trying to do, the best we can in that regard.
Mr. Grant.
Thank you. Finally, when you look at first of all, I don't know whether it's a charter or the current short-term agreement that requires the World Service objectives and priorities to be agreed with the Foreign and Diplomatic Officer, Development Office Secretary. Yeah. So there's a government minister who has to have some kind of conversation with you as to what the priorities are. You obviously rely on the government and licence fee negotiations to agree to the licence fee. So if you see yourself upset for other government of the day in power at the time, it could impact on your licence agreement. And finally, I'm not sure whether it's the charter or the current agreement, Part 49, actually says that the Secretary of State for DCMS, in agreement with the Treasury, can decide not to pay over all of the licence fee income to the BBC anyway. So given that there are so many ways in which different government ministers and government departments could take decisions that would significantly impact the BBC's financial sustainability, how do you manage to set all of that aside each time you have to make an editorial call to ensure that your output is absolutely impartial and is not only not influenced by requests being made from elsewhere, but is seen to be completely independent and impartial of any kind of external interference?
Indeed, and I think it goes to the very heart of the BBC, which is, we have to commission without fear and favour and go after the story and be utterly fair and impartial. Everyone has a view on that, but that is how we operate. I think the answer to your question is clearly there can be risks in this area. But I think over years we have worked out good management systems of that. With regard to the FCDO, it is appropriate that we work with them on the scope of our services. For instance, what languages, they're investing money, what language services do we wish to deliver, and what objectives we want to deliver in terms of reach and return on that investment. I think that is wholly different to the specific editorial decision making on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And I have to say, in my experience, that is not only honoured, it's something that I see as sacrosanct. I don't see, it wouldn't be acceptable if we had any editorial interference at all in that regard, having agreed the scope in the Charter and agreed the scope of the services. When it comes to DCMS, I think it is a clean discussion, it is about the Charter and then it is about the funding. Once we are through that, I can guarantee you we are fully editorial independent. And I have to say, I think overall, across the political spectrum, despite the noises that we'll always suffer in terms of people's view on our output, I think that is widely respected, I have to say. But certainly not something, if you came to the BBC and spent time with the senior team here, they value above everything our editorial independence. And we have an absolute faith in our ability to deliver impartially and fairly. That's not to say we're perfect, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Well, almost last word for you there, Mr. Davie, to parade the BBC's credentials. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. We will be watching this closely with our sister committee, the DCMS Select Committee, to keep an eye on what's happening at a critical financial time for the BBC. And I want to again thank our witnesses. Our transcript of this session will be up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and our report on this will be published at some point after the Easter recess. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.